My Adventures with Superman had a pretty fantastic streak going, with none of the first 5 episodes falling below an 8 out of 10 in my personal reviews. This episode, though, might just break that streak, as what is technically the worst episode of the season so far, even if that doesn't actually mean much. This video will be my review of My Adventures with Superman Season 1, Episode 6, titled My Adventures with Mad Science. To start things off, let's talk about the thing people were most talking about from the last episode, which is Lois and Clark's argument, which led into this one. And having seen this episode, it's become so clear how blown out of proportion the previous episode was by the internet, because this particular drama, which people were losing their minds over, doesn't really last very long, nor does it really feel like it will have long-lasting implications beyond this episode, which honestly was a bit underwhelming, if I'm being honest. Aside from that, the way the episode handled it was pretty good. Clark and Lois had some really nice moments here and there, although nothing that I would call special, and honestly it was mostly overshadowed by the Jimmy drama, which was pretty surprising. Some of it was also merged together to have the same effect, but it was more so, in my opinion, focused on Jimmy and less on Lois. What I will say, having seen this much more Jimmy-centric episode, is that it's pretty clear how much more fun to watch the show is when it's focusing on Clark and Lois. This episode doesn't have a lot of what made the first few episodes so fun to watch, like the flirting between them, not even when Clark's shirt was blown off, which was surprising. They never blush at each other or do their signature swooning, and on top of that, Clark never suits up as Superman for the first time since the pilot, all of which I guess kind of left a bit to be desired in comparison to all the previous episodes and what made them so fun to watch. That's not all to say that Jimmy is a bad character. I've said before, I think he's a fantastic comedic relief, but he's nowhere near as compelling a character as Clark or Lois, so any episode focusing on him will probably be mildly, if not much worse, or at the very least less entertaining and interesting than one that focuses on Clark and Lois. That being said, Clark and Lois have some very mature conversations that are not born out of some sort of forced anger that Lois would have towards Clark, such as when she was worried that he lied about his feelings for her, or other moments like Clark shielding Lois while not knowing if he's still bulletproof in this particular situation. These are really nice moments that take a far more realistic, three-dimensional, and mature approach, specifically in the dialogue itself, to the classic superhero trope of someone finding out someone close to them is a superhero, which so many other shows have failed to not feel forced. And since we're already talking about this, we might as well just already jump to Jimmy's reaction to this as well, as I was wondering how and when Jimmy would find out, and I gotta say, this is not how I expected it to go down at all. I don't think this episode was very funny up until this point, but Jimmy cutting off Clark's speech to tell him he knows he's Superman did get an audible laugh / gasp out of me. I did not see that coming, and I did really appreciate the comedic element to the scene. Again, this is a very mature way to go about this trope. Jimmy has clearly known Clark has powers for a while, must have assumed he was Superman when he debuted, but waited for him to tell him because it seemed like an important part of his life he wanted to keep separate. If nothing else, this was the best part of the episode. I love this scene. I love how they are handling this part of the Superman mythos, which has been very distinct and very refreshing in terms of the take on the secret identity and his relationships with Lois and Jimmy. Hell, I don't think Jimmy even knows he's Superman in the comics right now. Of course, I also thought the scene was really funny. What I didn't love about this episode is the very cheesy and honestly cliche way they resolved all the conflict in the end, with Clark, Jimmy, and Lois talking about it while in the middle of a gunfight. I did like Clark's side of things, saying that he just wanted to be normal and not be seen as an alien. That was compelling, but I did think that Jimmy and Lois's "we wouldn't care because we're friends" thing was a bit cheesy, and honestly, them having this conversation while not at all taking cover from a gunfight almost completely, if not entirely, kills the stakes of that fight and the action scene. I understand that that might have been the point. The conflict between the trio is what's supposed to be important here, not the gunfight. But this episode did lack a bit of action, and the one big action scene stakes were completely neutered. Also, this is supposed to be a fight with a robot owned by the closest thing we have to a main villain at this point, so I think we should take that seriously. Speaking of that main villain, the Brain, who I'll return to in a second, tells Clark a bit about this general in the end of the episode. The way he talks about him definitely adds a bit of aura of menace around him, especially with the fiery visual, but I couldn't help but feel like the Brain really should have told Clark the General's name. If it is General Lane, Lois's father, this would have created an interesting dilemma for Clark, or some interesting dialogue in the next episode of him having to talk to her about that. And I don't really understand why he wouldn't tell Clark that it's General Lane or what his name is. It's not a big deal, just something I did notice while watching. But I would say the biggest thing I was disappointed by, although it's a very mild disappointment, as was the entirety of the episode, is the identity of the gorilla from the end of the previous episode. My hope was the Ultra Humanite, maybe Titano, because that is another monkey Superman villain. As it turns out, it's Mansoor Mallah, accompanied by the Brain. This continues a trend this show has exhibited of taking non-Superman villains and using them really early on, even though there are similar Superman villains they could have gone for instead. Deathstroke could have been Bloodsport, Anthony Ivo could have been Morgan Edge, or maybe just one of the parasites turned into a billionaire, and Mallah could have been the Ultra Humanite. There was also Heatwave in the previous episode, and I'm sure there's a litany of Superman villains that could have been. I don't completely mind, I just think it's a bit weird, and I prefer Ultra Humanite as a villain over Mallah in the Brain. He's really interesting. That in mind though, they also weren't actually villains per se in this episode. Mallah and the Brain are actually pretty comedic at times. They could be funny in the ways they interacted with Jimmy, and especially in the way they kept on revealing more and more things they did in the 2 decades they spent there, and they were like increasingly bad things. And they were also probably more fleshed out than the villains of the week this show has had for the first few episodes. But at the same time, this might just be me, I kind of found myself being bored by them really quickly, as despite the fact that one is a brain in a robot who has a German accent, and the other one is a French gorilla, and those two are in love, they were also just kind of a bit dull. Didn't offer much in the way of action, and I'll be honest, their interactions were maybe a bit too silly. Like, they were going to kill Jimmy, but then he said that he's having issues, so then they're just going to be his best friends. I didn't hate them, not in the slightest, but I'm not exactly itching to see them again. And if we do, I'd rather just be alongside the Doom Patrol, if anything. In revealing a bit of their backstory, Mallah and the Brain also give us a bit more information into what seems like the overarching plot. I think we can infer from this episode that Net Zero Day, the day we've been seeing in the flashbacks, was 22 years ago, which is probably also the age that Clark is at this point as well. Meaning that, yeah, me and Clark are the same age, which is, that's great. This episode ends in a teaser that hints at the General teaming up with a far less disfigured than he was before Anthony Ivo, hinting that the bigger parasite we see in the opening will just be him again, which is a bit disappointing. I would have preferred to be a second parasite who's one of the parasites from the comics, but this is fine too. It also is a nice ending to the episode that sets up a subsequent one and the possibility of all the villains we've been seeing teaming up and joining Task Force X. And just like the rest of the episode, the animation is also not necessarily up to par with the rest of the season so far. The characters are appropriately emotive, but nothing special or impressive. The action is fine for the most part, but again, certainly nothing impressive or even memorable. It's weird. It's like they put less effort into this episode than basically every other episode in the season in basically every aspect. However, the first 5 episodes did set a pretty high bar, so even if it's worse, that does not mean it's bad. The episode does still have some great nice moments, some great comedy, great voice acting, good animation, and some decent action scenes, while taking a very interesting and unique approach on the classic superhero secret identity trope, resolving it in such a way that while mildly underwhelming, does still work. This is the worst episode of the series so far, but it's still pretty good, deserving a 7 out of 10, which actually brings the average of the season right back to an 8, since last episode was the first 9, so far this is a pretty great series, and I'm loving every episode.